this week we're looking at, even though the topic says transgenderism, we're really looking at the whole LGBTQ issue. This is one of the most challenging issues that the Muslim community will be facing. And so it's important to understand that already a lot of our youth and our community is being impacted by that. I personally have had cases of people approaching me indicating that their child is of a different orientation and they don't quite know what to do. So we were going to find a lot of this happening in the Muslim community. And so our imams down here actually recently had a meeting among themselves to discuss how we approach this area. I wasn't able to attend the meeting, but they are also trying to figure out what do we do about this issue. Tonight we just, in 1 hour, trying to understand a little bit about it so that you could become educated about it and not approach the matter in a way that is not relevant and meeting the challenge of the day with proper solutions. So we begin with definition of terms, and we may move a little bit quickly at certain parts of the presentation because I want to spend time more on another part. So I don't want to spend a lot of time about the challenges. I want to talk a little bit about the solution. So, but we need to have some terms defined. So the word homosexual was actually coined in Germany in 1860. And it's actually used as a medical term to study people who had sexual behaviors with the members of the same sex. So the homos in Greek means the same. And so this term was first coined then by the medical community to study people who behaved like that. Sexuality is actually a fairly recent term in the West, because traditionally, both in the East and the West, we used to define sexual nature as what the person is doing. Sexuality actually means what a person is. And this was like a new way of defining that. You know, sexual behavior has always been what you do. You're an addict or whatever it is, but to actually define a person in terms of their sexual orientation as an individual is a new concept. So homosexuality in today's terminology really means feelings of romantic or sexual attraction to members of one's own sex, as well as behavior based on those feelings. So it's having feelings for someone of the same sex and acting upon that by your behavior towards that direction. We have now gotten this new acronym, LGBTQ. And this is a terminology that has been used to describe all the various versions of this reality. So L stands for lesbian, G is for gay, B is for bisexual, T is for transgender, and queer or questioning is it Q. Now they have a new term which is added on, LGBTQIA. So IA means intersex and asexual. So intersex is that those refers to people who they're not clearly defined, their sexuality is not clearly defined because of genetic, hormonal, or biological differences. Whereas asexual describes one who don't really experience any sexual attraction. So basically this whole group is defining all the alternative lifestyle to the traditional husband and wife, man and woman relationship that we are accustomed to. And there's an umbrella term for all of it, and that is queer. Queer is an umbrella term for non-straight people, in simple terms. So anyone who is not non-straight, straight being the traditional way of how we understood relationships, this umbrella term refers to all of them, queer. So this is a basic, brief idea of some of the terminologies that you hear going around and to get an understanding of it. The history of these people and is that they were always looked on by society in a negative way as being an exception to the rule, as being people who were perverts and queers and did not live in the society in a way that would have set up traditionally. And they have always tried to fight back to advocate that they should be accepted. So the first group actually was formed in 1924, and I will go through these timelines very quickly. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association, in their diagnostic manual, they list homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. This is important because that means that the way anyone who says they're homosexual will be treated by them is to treat them as a sociopathic personality disturbance. And so that was what in the manual, that was what people studied to get their degrees in 1952. In 55, the first lesbian group was organized. In 61, and from the 60s to now, which is roughly about 60 years, is where the struggle of these people to get legitimacy and to get their rights began. So they have been fighting from that time, when they had the hippie movement and all of that. So in 1961, the first state to actually decide that homosexuality was not a criminal activity was in Illinois. And so they repealed out those laws. In 69, first publication, published newspaper kind of publication, started with a newsletter and then they moved on, was set up. In 70, the first gay parade was organized. In 73, you have a legal group was set up. They were called the Lambda Legal Group, and they became the first legal organization to fight for the equal rights of gays and lesbians. In 73, Maryland became the first state to statutorily ban same-sex marriage. So they had fits and starts. In December 1973, very important, the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. So now, all those who are now graduated after that, the diagnostic manual now said, no, homosexuality is not a sociopathic personality disturbance. They took it out, and now they got, in other words, these people became accepted as not a medical problem or a psychological problem anymore. That's a big victory for them. In 74, Kati Kozanchenko became the first LGBTQ American to be elected to public office, as she won a seat in Michigan. In 78, so they began to get involved in politics. Gilbert Baker, he designed the first flag, the rainbow flag. They chose the rainbow colors as the way to illustrate their particular orientation and their particular community. In 79, we had a huge march that was organized in Washington for lesbian and gay rights to take place. And it drew almost 175,000 to 125,000 people came. So their growth had become very big. On November the 30th, 1993, President Bill Clinton then decided that that the gays can be in the military as long as you don't openly declare. So don't ask, don't tell policy was established. 2003, the Supreme Court, which played a great role, strikes down homosexual conduct law, which decriminalizes same-sex conduct in Texas. In 2005, the California legislature becomes the first to pass a bill allowing marriage between same-sex couples. So now you had same-sex couples not only having relationship, before they were having relationships in private, in clubs, and now they were advocating to have recognition as married couples. In 2011, the don't ask, don't tell policy got repealed, and so men could now serve openly in the military, and they could openly declare themselves as lesbian or gay, and the military cannot discriminate against them. In 2012, Obama becomes the first president to support the freedom of LGBT couples to marry. So till in 2012 is when they begin to win that kind of support. And the Democratic Party also becomes the first major political party to have them on their national platform. So they were getting continued recognition by the people and the powers that be. In 2012 also, which was a very significant year for them, Tammy Baldwin, who is a gay woman, was elected to the US Senate. In 2013, the US court rules that legally married same-sex couples are entitled to federal benefits. So now they not only got recognition for being married, now they're able to be recognized to the extent that federal benefits will be entitled to them. And the US Supreme Court ruled that states cannot ban same-sex marriage. So now the US Supreme Court ruled that it's not an issue for the states to decide anymore. It made it a rule across the country. So these are tremendous victories that was won by this section of the community, the LGBTQIA. In 2016, Secretary of Defense Carter announces that the Pentagon is lifting the ban on transgender people serving openly in the US military. And in 2016, we had in Brazil, where we had the Olympic Games, large number of what they call out athletes competed in the Summer Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro. In 2016, Kate Brown becomes the highest ranking LGBTQ person elected to office in the United States. 2017, the District of Columbia residents can now choose a gender neutral option on their driver's license. So now they have been able to also win this in that they can put X for their gender, not male or female. You know, all the old forms had male or female. That was what you were considered. Now you have the ability to just put X. I'm not male, I'm not female. Same thing is in Canada, in India, in Bangladesh, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Nepal, all over. This is not only in the United States. Anything that's started and driven by the United States tend to filtrate to the rest of the world. So in all of these places, you can put X now for your driver's license. Then you had in the area of media, Daniela Vega became the first transgender presenter at the Academy Awards history. So even in that field, one of the stumbling blocks they got was from the Trump administration in 2018. He announced a new policy that bans transgender people from serving in the military. This was actually overturned by Biden. And then the Supreme Court also ruled that federal law protects LGBTQ workers from discrimination. Now we have, for example, Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. He became the first openly gay cabinet member confirmed by the Senate. So Dr. Rachel Levine, look at the level in which it is. Assistant Secretary for Health in the Department of Health and Human Services, became the first out transgender federal official to be confirmed by the Senate. The State Department announced that the US has issued the first US passport that you could put an X. And the Social Security Administration, which does the pension and all of that, announces that people can now choose their sex marker on their Social Security cards, on their records. So it's been a history of incredible activism by the LGBTQ community to get their recognition, to get their rights, to advocate for their cause. So now, today, they have actually infiltrated almost every space. They're not just saying, I just want to have my private life, I live it how it is. They want, and they are advocating that the whole world should recognize them and accept them for who they are. And so you have now books being written. They advocate for school libraries to have certain books about gays and lesbians. They have advocated for curriculums to be changed so that kids are taught from a very young age about homosexual behavior and homosexual people. They have a little thing they call the gender-bread man. And they actually act out, and they have drag queens and all kinds of that. performances in the schools. In politics, you've seen they have infiltrated that. In sports, we have so many people from this community as well. In media, a lot of countries, the embassies of which are pressured to try to recognize and to have the similar policy to the United States. For example, Kuwait came out and supported Obama, who said that these people need to be treated with respect and dignity and all of that. And so we have even Muslim countries are coming and slowly supporting these positions. The military, you mentioned, the medical profession, and religion as well. So we have a lot of the gay and lesbian community. They have also formed their own religious groups. We have, for example, Muslim gay organizations in which they have their own imams and everything. They also challenge the traditional, original understanding of religion about the whole issue. And they are reinterpreting verses and re-understanding the issue, or challenging the existing understanding of the issues regarding that. So they have been working in every space. And so today, they have been able to be very, very successful, and they continue to make great strides. So that's a very important history to understand. And so you are not, when we're talking about this community, we are talking about a formidable opponent, a formidable set of groups of people who have spent a long history striving and working very hard for their rights. And so when you're going to deal with them, we have to be able to understand that's a background. Now, it is important to understand, how did they come about? How did they evolve ideologically? So we need to also study that and have an appreciation. This is actually very important, because when we're going to talk to our Muslim youth who will come and say, I'm a lesbian, I'm a gay, or whatever it is, you can't dismiss them and say this is haram. You have to understand what has happened to that young person, right? And to understand the ideological pinnings that get connected to that statement. And so as Muslims, we have got to be not just, we have got to become informed and very aware of what is happening. So part of the problem, so we have to study it. Now, as early as 1950s and going back, every religious group was unanimous in condemning and declaring these people as deviant and sinful and immoral. So this was a unanimous view by Christians, by Jews, by Muslims, by everybody. They didn't have a space in society where they were accepted by as a norm, as a normal person. They were always looked at as a deviant group that was going in a direction that was sinful and immoral. So a lot of them were Christians. And part of the problem we had was that Christianity, has a very particular perspective about sex and sexuality that is different from Islam. In our faith, the Prophet ﷺ indicated to us that if you perform sexual acts that are illicit, you're going to get punished. But he also said that if you perform sexual acts that are lawful, then it is something that you'll be rewarded for. So Islam does not look at sex and sexuality in the same way like Christians tend to have a very anti-sex position. Celibacy is considered like a noble pursuit, to become celibate. And sex was considered bad. And that's why, for example, Jesus was never married. And so he was the one they're following. So he presented a role model of someone who didn't have sex, never got married. The Virgin Mary, to who he was born to, never had sex. And so the priests and the nuns, they were the positions of to be lauded and respected. And in order for them to become leaders of the church, they also had to live a life of celibacy without any sex. And so you find that that structure, that way of how the Christian religion organized itself led to people not having, Christians as a whole, having a very negative view about sex. And so celibacy was lauded as something noble, which was unlike Islam. And then coupled with that was that the laws of divorces in Christianity in the Bible is which you cannot divorce your wife. There's only one condition where you can divorce your wife. It's if somebody cheats, if she cheats on you. But the wife is not allowed to divorce her husband. If he beats her up, he's incompatible. She married somebody, for example, and he doesn't do anything. As long as he doesn't cheat, she cannot legitimately, within the religion, divorce her husband. So they are left to live lives where you have couples that domestic abuse and all of that without the ability to divorce. So you have those kind of situations in the Bible that teaches Christianity some of these things. If, for example, someone rapes you, you are forced to marry them, and so on. We don't go into that direction yet. So what has happened is that, coupled with that, people who are Christians became frustrated, who may have these tendencies and feelings. And so there was a revolution, a rebellion against this Christian religious and moral norms by the young people. And so they just erupted. And it coincided at a time when a new drug was born, the pill, what we call the pill, that allowed people to have sex without the high probability of being pregnant. And so without a fear of pregnancy now, sexual behavior became more rampant. So we can have sex, but we're not going to get children. There's no danger. So with the pill coming online, it added fuel and further freedom to those who are advocating this. And people also freed themselves from the fact that, generally sex used to be done only within marriage. So they took the step to say, look, we can have sex without marriage. We're going to just call it shacking up. We're not going to go and get licensed and so on. So a lot of young people, they rejected the strict laws of marriage and they decided to just live with each other and to just have their relationship. And so the moral restriction of marriage before sex, that you generally used to be, you have to get married before you have sex, was now replaced with just, as long as the two parties agree, then that is perfectly fine, because we are not putting that moral restriction on us anymore. And so people were not getting married anymore in the vast numbers, or they didn't see marriage as the only option to have sex. And with that, the family broke down, because so that whole structure became weakened. And so it led to a lot of divorces. People just wanted to be free. It led to people having sex and the father just gone. Delinquency, single mothers and single family and single child, and all of that now became part of the reality of families. And of course, women now had to go out and fend for themselves because their husbands were absent. There was not that moral discipline to stay with your family. And so a lot of women now were forced into the workplace, coupled with the fact that women were championing their rights and the feminist movement. So now women entered the workforce, and that led to having to leave their kids at home by themselves. And so that became another reality in which our kids were now not getting the kind of nurturing care that they require from moms, especially because moms were working. And so the kids that grew up now became deficient to that level where they were not becoming functioning members of the society. The anchor of reproduction and marriage and family and morality now became just, as long as I can fulfill my sexual desire, then that is all I need. And that led to further freedoms where, okay, why do I have to fulfill my sexual desire just with a woman and a man? Let me experiment. Let me go and have it with a man, let a woman have it with a woman. And so this led to the gay movement and the freedom got extended to trying out and experimenting with all kinds of situations. And, and so this led to the movement slowly gaining strength and becoming popular. Yet society continued to treat them as deviant. It was a long battle for them to do that. So they started to invade in society and get into different parts. And every time, what they did was they attached their behavior and they tied it to the need for freedom, the liberalist agenda. So they felt that if you're telling us what we can't do and what we can do as religion does, then you are depriving us of our freedom. So when I go out and I have a relationship with a man and a man, I am actually challenging your norms of restricting me. You are not allowing me to be who I am. And so that became a way of them to be able to challenge and to fight against every form of restriction that may be put in their path. And one of the most genius things they did was that there's three things: there's desires, there's actions, and there's identity. We've never identified ourselves by our behavior. What they did, they tied the three together. And they said, look, my behavior is because of who I am. That's my identity. That's how I was born. That was, in other words, before, as we mentioned, sexuality was something you do. It was an action. You had a desire, you acted upon it. Never before it was sold to you as, but this is who I am as an individual. And so what that allowed is that, in other words, I can't help myself. I was born that way. And so, for example, a blind person that is born blind, we treat him in a different way. We tell the blind person, why you can't see? Why you do, you're not going to. If we begin to criticize and condemn a blind person for being blind, then we are looked at as being cruel. We're looked at as being harsh. We're looked at as being uncivilized because I'm criticizing a blind man for being blind through no fault of his. So if the gay community can convince you that we are born like this, your criticism of us becomes unjust. Your criticism of us is trying to condemn us for something which we can't help, which we don't have the power to help ourselves. This is how we are, and this is our identity. And that is the great victory that they have managed to foist upon society in allowing the society to say that this is something that we're born with. This is something that is a part of who we are. It's not that we necessarily want to go and do all these things, but this is who we are. We can't help ourselves. And so they made it very, very difficult for anyone who wanted to criticize them. They were considered ignorant. They were considered unscientific because they tried to link this now. We're trying to prove scientifically, even though all the proofs have shown difference, that scientifically they were born. There's nothing called a gay gene. You're not born with any gay gene. They tried very hard with the nature versus nurture argument. But the reality has shown that you have two identical twins that are born. If you had something genetic which causes you to be gay, how is it that in almost 70% of the cases, the two twins don't behave the same way? One is straight, one is gay. So if you were genetically disposed to that, how is it that we're having difference? And there are many other arguments that goes against that concept. But they have managed to convince the medical community. They've managed to convince the political powers that be. They've managed to convince the educational people in the schools. And so you now become a minority in trying to deal with these people or trying to criticize them or trying to condone them. I mean, or speak bad about them. You're looked at as the one that is really antisocial, unjust, and so on. And there's a couple other things which we'll talk about. So the fight to be able to withstand that has become very difficult and very, very hard for religious people, for Christians, and a lot of the Christian pastors and the Christian leadership are slowly acquiescing and giving up that fight and trying to find a way to accommodate that. And so for the Muslims, we also have to be able to find a way to be able to withstand, and what do we do? So that's what we want to talk about a little bit in terms of that. We want to show you a chart which kind of summarizes some of the problems that, or the issues that it is. So these three things, sex, reproduction, and marriage, were always tied together. In other words, the marriage, you want to have sex, you have to get married. Part of why we have sex is to be able to get children. So sex, reproduction, and marriage was all bundled up in a moral code and a system that promoted each of the three as part of each other. And so what they did was they worked very hard to separate these three. So sex has nothing to do with reproduction. Sex has nothing to do with marriage. We can have sex without marriage. And so part of what they've succeeded is these three things, which were traditionally bonded together by society and religious groups, they separated them and they made them like separate things, which allowed them to do what they did. And then there were three things which always used to be separate. They have managed to say, hey, they're all the same. So my desires, my actions, and my identity are all one. Before, they were separate. You have desires, but you don't have to act on them. In fact, in Islam, you could have a negative desire. You can have like, I intend to do something bad, as a hadith, long hadith mentioned. But if I don't act upon it, I get rewarded. Even though I had a bad desire, but as long as I don't act upon it, I'm only accountable when I act. I'm not taken to task by Allah for my desire and my inclination. You know, all of us have desires. Even married men may look at a woman and have a desire, even though he has his wife. All of us have desires that sometimes are wicked and evil, but we don't act them out. It is when you act them out that you become held accountable. So desires and actions are separate things. And it doesn't mean because you have a desire, you know, that you're going to go and do that. I have a desire to drink alcohol to see how it tastes. Doesn't mean you'll act upon it. So they're separate. And then not because I act on something that defines who I am as a person. So what they've done is by getting you to believe and to buy into the idea that my desires, my actions spring from the fact that this is who I am. This is my identity. And so I don't separate them. I can't separate them. And that allows them this loophole or this freedom to do the things and to advocate their position. You know, they also deny that we used to have biological sex, gender identity, express sexual orientation. You know, these relationships, they have all shattered them and recreated, you know, man and woman. That was used to be the gender. You know, now we have 64 different identity. So they have changed all of that. And then what they did was they also attached the race discrimination for people of other races. They attached that as saying, you know, when you discriminate me as a gay person, it is similar to how you're discriminating against racial discrimination, or when you're discriminating against gender, or when you're discriminating against people. So they linked the three and they made an argument that you are actually a racist when you discriminate against a gay person. You are actually a person who is against gender because you are discriminating. So they have managed to also create this false equivalence of the argument towards them and the arguments towards these. So this is part of what they have done. And they have gotten bolder and bolder. Last year, for example, in Canada, on the International Day of Homophobia and whatnot, they published one of the universities there, they got them to sponsor this huge day and the parade and all of that. And their posters that they put up showed two hijabi sisters kissing. And the Muslims were outraged in Canada and they protested. And initially the university said, we are not we're not moving. We're keeping it. They also wrote an article in their newspapers saying that Islam actually don't promote that being homosexual is a wrong thing. And they tried to construct the idea that Islam actually supports that and that it doesn't have anything against them. The Muslims, alhamdulillah, were able to protest in such large numbers that eventually the university backed down. They pulled the poster, they withdraw the stuff. But it's a rare win for Muslims. And this was done mainly by the Muslim youth. So then we have to talk now about, one, what does Islam say? And two, how do we approach this issue? So I have 15 minutes. Let's see if we can do it in this time. So in our religion, the Sharia, it categorizes actions. We have halal, haram, and as you know, we have mubah, permissible, we have makruh, undesirable, and so on. But the main two rules is something is either lawful, it's unlawful. And sexual acts also come in relation to this. Halal sexual relations are those between a man and a woman in marriage, in Islamic marriage. That's what we consider as halal sexual relations. Every other kind of relations is haram. Haram acts are further defined. So you have kaba'ir, which is like the major sins which we covered in a past class, zina, liwat, and others. So liwat is like having male and male sodomy and so on, and other kinds of like relations, like oral sex and so on between two persons. So these are considered major sins. All of these are classified as prohibited intrinsically. The Sharia also prohibits things which lead to illicit sexual behavior, touching, gazing, So these are also part of what is prohibited. And the Sharia, as we know, immodest dressing, the way you speak, your behavior, they're considered muharram li ghayrihi, prohibited on account of another, that it leads to something that is haram. We also are of the position that if you fall into sin, it does not make you unworthy of God's love, forgiveness, and mercy. So someone a Muslim guy or a Muslim girl who is gay or lesbian, it does not make them non-Muslim, number one. And number two, it does not deprive them of Allah's love and mercy. So falling into sin does not take you out of the religion. It just makes you a sinful person, right? So that is important to understand. There is a resource that is used to help people. It was done by one of our brother, Wahid Jensen, and it's an 88-episode podcast in which he provides lots of information and resource for people who are struggling with this issue. So the position in our religion is very clear. There's long verses I didn't want to, because I know I wouldn't have time, dealing with Prophet Lut. They're trying to reinterpret those verses, saying if they mean rape, they don't mean sodomy, and so on. But that argument is not holding water, right? So as a Muslim community, we have got to really figure out what do we do. So these are some actions that we need to perhaps take. Number one is the language. We've got to be careful when we are discussing this issue to don't use borrowed terms from their community. We start out by defining these terms, because these terms create and assume a certain bias and a certain understanding. So we should be careful about the terminology we're using, and don't get sucked into using their community, their way of how they are expressing these things. So we should say male, female zina. In other words, this is a adultery, fornication of male, female, where female going to female and male going to male, male sodomy, lesbian sex. So we should use Islamic terminology like zina, liwat, sihak, rather than just using their terminology. So this ensures that we are clear, because we have now the ability to say, what does zina mean in your religion? Well, this is what zina means. It have the orientation, it have the objective, it have the basis, the foundation. But if you just use their term, then you're buying into their conceptions as well. Number two is we have to clearly establish the Islamic gender and sexuality paradigm. So we've got to be able to establish that it is independent of the one that is being held in the West right now. That God has created everything in pairs. He has made two genders, affirmed gender differences as a real and as a God-given thing. And we've got to deconstruct this sexual behavior, identity framework that the West allows to happen, and to be able to not buy into that my desire, my behavior, and my identity are all linked as one. We've got to be able to let them understand that they're separate. And we have to affirm that illicit sexual activity is not permissible. And if you do it right, you do it halal way, then it is celebrated and rewarded. If you do it the wrong way, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, it leads the individual and the communal destruction. It leads to a lot of breaking up of homes and families when you have adultery and fornication and all this other weird behavior. Number three, we've got to point out that there's a neo-colonial nature of this project, right? Because what's happening is that, we had the West came to the Muslim world and colonized it so many years, and we saw all of imposing their ideology, imposing their way of life on those poor societies who either accepted them or was faced a bullet, where they had to choose, either you choose the lifestyle of our masters or we die, and so the way this movement is projecting itself is either the West has now kind of saying this is who we are, and so they are defining this as the truth and they're imposing it on other communities. So you want some money from the West, part of that is that you've got to open your societies to allow that, and we see that happening in many places. Saudi Arabia, for example, unfortunately is buying into this, because in order to get the goodwill of the Western society, we need to compromise with our values and adopt some of theirs. And so we have big concerts now in Saudi Arabia. They celebrated Halloween, and they have begun to embrace some of these as a way of gaining acceptance and recognition from the West. And so this is the same neo-colonial approach of the past, of trying to bring your culture and imposing on us, saying that we don't have the true version of truth and reality. And so, and a lot of our young people will fall victims to this, because they see the West as progressive, as successful, as scientific, as the future. And so they will abandon whatever values we have, which they see as backward and archaic, and go for that. So it's a big, huge fight. We've got to reject the sexual identity paradigm that individuals are in Islam. We don't define people by their sexuality. We define people by how Allah has defined us. We have man and woman. We dignify people with respect because they were created by Allah, not by the desires they experience. The sexual identity paradigm is inherently incompatible with Islam. We should use descriptive terms and adjectives such as he experiences same-sex attraction, or she experiences gender dysphoria, rather than he is gay or she is trans. We should use our own terminology. And we should not reduce a person to a sexual identity. Person is more than their your sexual orientation is just one small part of who you are as a person. You're an intellectual person. You're an emotional person. You're a loving person. To reduce your identity and the essence of who you are to just your sexuality is to do injustice to that person, to see them as a sexual being. And so we are not allowed to do that. Our religion don't teach that. We are considered, Allah said, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We are created in the best possible way. So we don't see humanity just like that, where you define yourself into this low-level definition. The other thing that is important is that we should not force ourselves to make exceptions and go out of our way to change our rules and our principles and our integrity and our paradigms to accommodate those who may want to practice that lifestyle. So doesn't mean we will treat the person nicely. So as Muslims, we don't tie homosexuality acts to identity, firstly, as we mentioned. And so we don't allow that kind of behavior to begin to invade our space, violate our rights, or reject, our dignity. So we've got to be able to ensure that the communities that we're setting up, that we don't allow such people to have legitimacy. Like we had a case in Miami where they elected one of the gay or persons as the head of the MSA and so on. When you give power to these people, then you are actually in essence supporting them or recognizing them as doing legitimate actions. At the same time, we should not deliberately point out an individual who may have this tendency or who may say they're gay or lesbian and try to expose them to the community. They're already dealing with a lot in trying to struggle that. We actually need to be a support system for them individually, but as a community, we don't allow such behavior to happen. Just like we won't allow other kinds of behavior, someone coming and drinking alcohol in the masjid and so on. But the issue of this particular issue is a different issue. Like fighting alcohol, we have medical reasons and so on. But when I oppose someone and says, our religion says we don't drink alcohol or we don't condone it, it's an easy fight. But when you say my religion does not like gay, or for all the reasons we discussed, you are now looked at as the one on the wrong side of the fence. So you're losing the moral battle because it's looked at as immoral to oppose these people. So it's a little bit different. They have advocated that their position is a morally right position. They have the right to be and to express their feelings and their beliefs. So we have to balance between helping the individuals who have this behavior while at the same time thinking about the community and how you protect the community from this kind of behavior. So it's a very big game. We've had people who dress up in dress and try to pray in the sisters area, and you're going to have more of that coming all the time. So we've got to balance the needs of the community while at the same time helping those troubled souls to be able to deal with the reality that they have. So, so we have to have that balance, right? And if you have very great activists, deviant activist types from the gay community or the LGBTQ community, we should not allow them to disrupt our spaces or our events. We've got to push back and really make sure that we are advocating our positions and our principles. We've got to also be more proactive in helping those of our young people who are getting involved in this. So we have to support proactively those people who are struggling with it, individually trying to find answers, having a feeling that I don't know how I can't act on how I feel. We've got to teach them to understand that not because you have that desire means that you're compelled to act on it, but you need help in being able to have restraint. Of the word taqwa means restraint, that you don't just do what you feel like. All of us in this world, we have a lot of desires to do a lot of things, but part of a believer is that you have to have the ability to restrain yourself from doing the haram, from restrain yourself from doing crazy things. It's just part of being a responsible human being. So we've got to help them with that and help them to understand this is not something that you're born. Yes, you're sometimes born with a feminine nature or a masculine nature or with a tendency to be more masculine or more feminine. And each of those who have that, it is part of their test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to struggle with that. but don't succumb to it. So you've got to be able to, they have an extra test of trying to deal with this. Allah has created them this way, and they will find it more difficult to fit in societies and to have normal lives. But this is part of the test. So we've got to provide mentors to help them, not to shun them, not to dismiss them. They're going to be more and more in our community. And so our community have got to become very good at really helping and organizing ourselves to deal with this issue, which is coming full blur, coming really in a strong way to our community, and we better be prepared for it. And then we must help them by, we have to let them understand that what you're doing, it's committing a sin. Allah is forgiving. You can ask Allah to help you, to forgive you. So we've got to be able to don't push them in a way that they feel they have to make a decision, pick Islam or pick being gay. We have to be able to let them understand you can be both. You can be a gay person and you can be a believer as well, right? You're a sinning believer, but who doesn't sin? Everybody have a sin that they're dealing and managing. So we have to let them understand that you're not alone. Everybody is committing sins in all different ways, and every one of us are dealing with our sins. But understand that when you commit to Allah and you connect to Allah and you make dua to Allah, that Allah is the one that can help you, that can, provide that. So we have got to have a very compassionate ear to them and be able to help them to maneuver this. We have got to help the parents of these children to overcome the trauma of hearing their child has become these strange behaviors. So there's a lot of work to be done on the educational end, on the resources end, in providing services end. So it's really a huge thing. And hopefully tonight we get a little bit of understanding. So when a child come and say, I'm close with it, I'm gay, you have to understand it's a very complex thing for that child or that young man, a young woman. And dismissing him and just saying, oh, that's haram, brother, you're not going to punish you or whatever it is not an adequate answer. And so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to continue to understand this issue and to be able to recognize that these people, they are in our society. They are our doctors, our teachers, our lawyers, they're part here. And so we've got to be able to treat them nicely. Don't necessarily because we could condone what they behave, but we have to be civil. Our Prophet has said we have to be civil to people, to treat them nicely. They're going to be all over our society. They're part of our society. So may Allah help us to understand this and to approach it in a wise way. And so I close with the verse, Udu ilallah, call to the way of Allah with wisdom and beautiful admonition and dispute and debate with people in a manner that is best. And Allah knows best those who are stray and those who are rightly guided. Assalamu alaikum.